couple of days ago, we talked about an obscure vessel made by, among other corporations, Lorinar Industries. And that was the Field Secured Container Vessel, essentially a massive space train which could grow to lengths of over 20 kilometers. Today, however, we'll be talking about a much smaller, much less common vessel, but one that's a bit more well known by fans, and that is the Torpedo Sphere. A class of ships so powerful, some within the Alliance referred to it as the Pocket Death Star. We've got a very deep breakdown which should answer most of your questions about the Torpedo Sphere, including the genius way it worked, for today's video. Today's video is sponsored by my good pals over at Vite Ramen. If you've been watching the channel, you already know who Vite Ramen is, but I'll remind you anyway. Vite Ramen is a small American-owned business which makes really good ramen. I mean, it's that simple. The fact that they pay their employees a living wage and don't make false health claims and make healthy food is great, but let's be honest, you're here for the tasty noodles. The best flavor of Vite Ramen is Massaman Curry, not just because it's the one that I created, but also because it's really great. That is sold out right now. I always recommend as a backup the roasted soy chicken. You will be happy with it. If you've tried Vite Ramen, let me know down below, especially if you've tried my flavor. If you haven't, now's a great time because you can go down in the description, click the link, use the code ECKHARTS, you'll get free shipping within the contiguous USA, you'll get 10% off, and you'll get some special gifts. Let's talk about Star Wars. Alright, so the Torpedo Sphere was an incredibly unique Imperial vessel. I mean, just look at it. And on that note, unfortunately, there aren't a whole lot of images, so you will have to bear with me for today's video. According to the Imperial sourcebook, the Torpedo Sphere was a dedicated siege platform designed to accomplish one mission: knock out a planet's shields. As we've discussed multiple times on the channel, planetary shields were arguably the best defense a planet could muster against any sort of invading fleet. Even an entire battle group of Star Destroyers can't pound through the strongest planetary shields. Only something like a Death Star has enough brute force to do that. The Torpedo Sphere had 500 proton torpedo launchers, but despite what many think, it didn't simply overpower a planetary shield. Although torpedo spheres were often described as miniature Death Stars and, according to the Death Star Technical Companion, were based on the plans of the Death Star, a torpedo sphere is actually a very interesting and precise weapon. So how it works is the torpedo sphere parks in orbit around a planet. As the shield is raised, it uses an array of advanced sensors to try to pinpoint weak points. Because of how a shield is generated, usually from multiple generators with portions which are overlapping and others which are naturally a little less protected, whether it's because they're further from the generator or they're not overlapping whatsoever. These weak portions would often only be like 20% weaker than the rest of the shield, but it was still the point that the torpedo sphere would hone in on. It then assaults that point primarily through torpedoes, but also through things like tractor beams. The idea was not to destroy the planetary shield through this method. Rather, they were simply trying to poke a hole that would usually only last for several seconds, but that's when the torpedo sphere's guns would go to work. It also had a set of turbo lasers, and those sensors which had been analyzing the shields for weak points had hopefully also identified the location of the shield generator, which it would then try to strike from orbit. Once the shield is down in one spot, the invasion or bombardment can begin, or if necessary, other parts of the shield can be chipped away at. I do, however, see some issues with this plan. For one, if the shield does fall, that also gives the planet an opportunity to strike back if they have things like ion cannons or turbo lasers. However, we know that the torpedo sphere can operate pretty well at medium range, according to sourcebooks, so maybe it actually outranges ground-based weapons. Another option, install a dedicated shield simply for the planetary generator. This is kind of a tough one because as the shield is up, you won't be able to project a shield at all, but it's at least one option to help protect against the bombardment. Still, as I've hopefully laid out, a torpedo sphere was not something of pure power. I mean, it certainly was powerful, but rather they were doing what X-Wing pilots did, coordinating munition strikes against a certain part of the shield, hoping to overload a section and find a vulnerability. You could almost imagine the torpedo sphere trying to squeeze its fingers into the planetary shield to pull it apart and do some damage to the surface. According to the Imperial sourcebook, the Empire had 6 torpedo spheres in service, but was also in the midst of trying to produce more. We also see references to early prototype testing. Those ships may still exist, or they may have been fully upgraded to the full service torpedo spheres. On the other hand, the Imperial handbook suggests that there were hundreds in service, but it's very likely that that was propaganda. Torpedo spheres were not treated as an ordinary threat by Alliance High Command, and they were really approaching the superweapon level of concern. Starships of the Galaxy Guide specifically reiterated that no more than 6 were in service at once, and I mean, do you really need more than that? The torpedo sphere was very effective at its job, but the Empire wasn't ordinarily sieging that many worlds at once with full energy shields. So it's a thing that does its job well, but its job is somewhat niche unless you're fighting a full-scale war. The Lords of the Expanse sourcebook takes a closer look at the guts of the torpedo sphere. I don't find that as interesting, so I'll just leave that to you guys to get all the details, but some takeaways from my reading is that torpedo spheres pretty heavily followed Imperial design principles, and the inside of one looked pretty similar to, say, the Death Star. And I think I mentioned this earlier, but torpedo spheres were based off the Death Star's plans. Torpedo spheres also had no starfighter contingent, at least typically, though they did have at least a couple of dozen small hangars for shuttles and transports, and the reason for that is the torpedo sphere was always guarded by a fleet. Again, these things have one particular role: take down the shield. You're not going to do that unless you've got some other greater purpose. Unlike the FSCV we mentioned at the beginning of the video, torpedo spheres were very crew intensive and usually had over 60,000 people on board. Because of the precise nature of the torpedo firing, the individual tubes weren't actually fire linked. Rather, there were firing stations which controlled 4 tubes and had 4 gunnery officers placed around the ship. The interior was mostly made up of course, torpedo storage, a large reactor core, and maintenance and engineering. Unsurprisingly, a torpedo sphere had a very high cost of construction and operation because of not only the advanced materials needed, but also the cost of running 60,000 crew members and having enough munitions to actually break through a shield. As for famous individual torpedo spheres, well, there's one in that source book I just mentioned. There's also one in the Black Ice source book. It's on its way to, well, break through a rebel base shield when it's rammed by the Black Ice itself. The New Essential Guide to Warfare and a StarWars.com article both make mention of torpedo spheres being used by Imperial warlords after the Battle of Endor. Because of their shape and the status that probably would have came with torpedo spheres after Endor, they kind of remind me of Worldcraft. I covered these a long time ago in a prior video, but Worldcraft, as we learn in the Crystal Star, were essentially pleasure craft in the shape of false planets that Palpatine gave to his most loyal servants. But I think that's all I wanted to share for today's video. I hope you found it informative. Is there something else from an old source book or that hasn't been covered on YouTube you'd like to see me take a look at on the channel? Let me know all of that and more down below. Till next time, guys, again, I hope I made your afternoon or evening or morning good. Be safe, I love you, may the Force be with you.